Changing a country isn't easy, but change is inevitable. And the choices we make today will shape our country for generations to come. That's why we've published our first book from Australia Institute Press. What's the Big Idea offers 32 ideas for a better Australia, from leading thinkers such as Bob Brown, Sally McManus, Dr. Emma Shortis, and Professor Brian Schmidt. The essays are a roadmap and a reminder that the solutions exist. Australia just needs the courage to implement them. Visit australiainstitute.org.au or follow the link in the show notes to order your copy of What's the Big Idea today.
It varies wildly from minister to minister. Some are super proactive, will reach out early, will offer briefings, and then others, I think, forget that there is a Senate and have a bit of an oh shit moment when the legislation's on its way to the Senate and you're getting frantic calls and saying, well, it's not my bill.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains economics, politics and policy in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute. And Australia's political landscape is changing dramatically, with more people turning away from the major parties. And at the last federal election, Australians elected the largest crossbench to the lower house in modern history.
These are dramatic changes in our politics happening before our eyes.
Turning a wave of once blue ribbon seats teal.
People were feeling ignored, neglected, and taken for granted for way too long.
What we have achieved here is extraordinary. Safe Liberal seat, two-term incumbent, independent.
Ahead of this year's federal election, opinion polling is pointing to a likely minority government, giving crossbenchers more power to negotiate with the government of the day. But what is it actually like to hold the balance of power? This week, we're bringing you a conversation between Amy Remeikis, the Australia Institute's chief political analyst, and two people who know firsthand what it's like to be the deciding vote. Senator David Pocock was elected as an independent by ACT voters in 2022, and he's negotiated with the current government over climate change, housing, electoral reform, industrial relations, and more. Tony Windsor AM was the independent member for New England from 2001 to 2013, and he was in the balance of power in the Gillard minority government. Together, they discussed dealing with the pressures of holding a crucial vote, how they approached negotiations with the major parties, and why there is so much fearmongering about minority parliaments in Australia. This was recorded live at our latest Politics in the Pub event in Canberra on Wednesday, the 26th of February. I hope you enjoy.
Now, when we look at the electoral map, both the major parties are on the nose. When you look at the polls and the primary vote, the most likely outcome on the numbers at this point in time is a hung parliament. At the moment, it looks like on the numbers, it would be a Labor-led hung minority government. That's not absolutely guaranteed. And we thought that it would be a really good time to have a chat to the people who know about what minority government looks like, what the negotiations look like, how a hung parliament operates, and whether it really is the chaos and confusion that we've all been led to believe. So, gentlemen, we know all the lines. Minority government creates chaos and confusion. We need certainty. Governments can only pass their mandate when they have a majority, yada, yada, yada. So what is the truth based on your experiences? Because aren't we kind of always in a minority, given that we have that extra chamber, the Senate, where the government of the day rarely has a majority? I mean, it's not as if there haven't been mass negotiations in this parliament, David.
Yeah, every day in the Senate is minority government. Neither party's had a majority since John Howard in 2007. So there's that constant negotiation when the major parties don't agree. And I think people would be shocked how much they do agree on. They pass a lot of legislation together and will often team up to defeat the whole crossbench on things like, making sure we don't get more money for our gas, gambling reform, lobbying reform, ministerial diaries, a whole bunch of things. They'll vote together. But on the things where there are differences, that's where the crossbench comes into effect. And I guess through negotiation, the thing I see is that you actually get better policy. I think more thought through, more robust policy, because as an independent, you're out there consulting with experts, with the people you represent, and I think often strike a better balance to actually get things through. So the Senate's chaos a lot of the time, but that's definitely not because of minority government. And we're already seeing the fear-mongering from the major parties. They're terrified about what a growing crossbench means, and we saw that in the electoral reform stitch-up. But my experience has been it works better. A bit biased, but I think we get far better outcomes that reflect what Australians want when we actually negotiate.
And Tony, you're fairly experienced in minority government. How do you think it works?
Well, if I could firstly thank you, Amy and David, for the opportunity to be here, and to the crowd that's here. This is the first time I've been back in Canberra for 9 years. I've only been here twice since I left Parliament, so it was good to have a bit of a drive around this afternoon. David made some very important points there, particularly in relation to the Senate, and I think a lot of people tend to forget the Senate in terms of the deliberations. Most of the time, the Senate is a hung parliament. And most of the time, and there's a few crazies there, I'd be the first to say that, but not this guy. This guy deserves great credit for what he's done in the period of time that he's actually been in the parliament. I think that's quite phenomenal. But in relation to the lower house, every time there's a close parliament, and nearly every parliament's close now, whether it be in the States or the Commonwealth, people say, oh, nothing will get done, it'll be weak, it'll be chaotic, it'll be unstable, all of those things to describe. And they're doing that purely for political purposes, as you'd know. They want to have a majority where the executive of the government and those who fund the executive want to be able to ram through their particular agenda. They tend to forget about the Senate when they're talking that language as well. And I think it's very important that all of us think very seriously about how we vote in the Senate as well as the House.
Just on that, Tony, how does the mechanics of determining a government when it is in a minority position actually work? Are you always bound to vote for their legislation, or are you bound at all? Or are there any rules for any of this, or is this just something that the media makes up?
Well, people try and create rules, but I've been in two hung parliaments, one in 1991 when Nick Greiner, the Liberal Premier, took the premiership, and in 2010. I was also in another one with a majority of one in New South Wales, and it was very similar to a hung parliament because Bob Carr at the time was petrified of losing one seat. So I've had some degree of experience in relation to that. What happens in a hung parliament, though, is there'll be an election on the Saturday, and I've been talking to a few of the candidates about this particular thing. There's this enormous pressure on people. What are you going to do if, in fact, there is a hung parliament? Who are you going to vote for? Who are you going to support? Which of the major parties? There's media pressure and the pressure of the major parties themselves demanding what, in fact, people may do. Well, it's terribly presumptuous of any candidate to presume they're going to win the seat to start with. And the way I'd answer that particular question these days is whoever's asking it, say, well, you tell me what the numbers are. Who won this election we haven't had yet, or who's got the most seats? How many have they got? What's been the outcome in the Senate? Senate's critical again. All of these issues, what were the issues they actually ran on? The media are asking people now what they're going to do in the event of a hung parliament when there's no policies on the table. All of these things have got to come into consideration. But one of the things I have been saying is there is a third option. There's this view that you either have to support the Labor Party or the Liberal Party. Well, you don't. You don't have to at all. And in fact, Rob Oakeshott and I looked very serious at doing this, not supporting anybody in 2010. And the major reason we didn't do that was that we were concerned, very few living people had actually experienced the hung parliament at the federal level. So there was real concern whether something could actually work. So we thought it was best to send a message after that 15 or 16 days to the public that we thought a government could be formed and that we would support supply and confidence for Julia Gillard. Outside that, and that agreement's not worth the paper it's written on. If anybody says, oh, I've got an agreement from so-and-so to support supply and confidence and only not do so in terms of, in the circumstances of maladministration or corruption, that paper is worthless. Has no legal standing, it really has no political authority, but it does give guidance to the community in terms of what the intention is. But the important point I'd like to leave, in a sense, tonight is that the independent candidates that are standing really should treat that question as ridiculous as it is and realise that they have the capacity not to support either side and remain truly independent in terms of the political process. The major parties keep saying from time to time, we won't do any deals with anybody. We don't want to deal with anybody. Well, take them at their word. Don't do a deal with them. And let them scrub it out in the chamber as to the formation of a government. And then, quite rightly, as all independents that I've seen in particular parliaments do, those independents will support the right of that government to have access to supply and confidence. All else is on the table, and so it should be. And David's a classic example of that in the Senate, but you'd see that in the House of Reps with the independents voting on different issues and creating leadership on a whole range of issues.
How do these negotiations work? So how does it work in the Senate? Does someone just knock on your door and be like, hey, with some food, and then talks to you about a bill, and then you go, yeah, cool, I'll support that? I say food because I'm Lithuanian, and if I didn't come to somebody's house with food, the ghost of my ancestors would eat me. So I just assume that this is something that happens everywhere.
Sounds like how it should work, but no. It varies wildly from minister to minister. Some are super proactive, will reach out early, will offer briefings, keen to sit down and talk about issues, kind of work out the starting points of what I'm thinking, what other crossbenchers are thinking versus what they want to do. And then others, I think, forget that there is a Senate and have a bit of an oh shit moment when the legislation's on its way to the Senate and you're getting frantic calls and saying, well, it's not my bill. I need to go and consult on it and do all those things. So it really varies. And I would have liked to have said that Labor have got better at it over the term, but I don't think they have. I've found it strange the lack of focus on the growing crossbench, and I thought it was really telling the legislation they rammed through on the last day. That I think really shows their attitude, and they'll talk about the parties of government and how we are a Westminster system, but there's absolutely nothing in our constitution that talks about the parties. And when it comes to the Prime Minister of the day, really it could just be up to the Parliament.
So when do you know that you're in play? Like, what's the pressure like? So let's take housing, for instance. That was something everyone knew that the coalition had said no to. So that means that the government has no choice but go to the crossbench. What's the difference like when suddenly they need X number of votes from that crossbench in the Senate?
Well, there's obviously a lot more pressure. There's a lot more fun too because you have that leverage and you want to use it for good, to actually talk to experts, talk to Canberra and say, hey, this piece of legislation, one, is it good? How can we make it better? And I think we saw that with housing. I didn't agree with some of the politicking the Greens were doing on it. I thought it was deliberately obstructionist. I agreed with some of their things about the need for far more investment in social and affordable housing. But when it actually got down to negotiations, there were, I think one of the amendments I got was ends up being an extra $6.3 billion when you sort of add it over the life of the half, and the Greens got more money. So yeah, it's an interesting process. And as I said, it varies wildly from minister to minister. And one of the things that I've really enjoyed is being able to engage across the parliament on different issues. There were a number of times in the Senate over the last 3 years where the coalition and the entire crossbench passed bills against the government's will, either things that they didn't want to do or that we all thought, this is a good idea, you guys should be doing it. So I think to me that's what a democracy can be and should be.
And Tony, we saw some of that in the 43rd Parliament, where we had the most number of bills passed, I think, by Parliament, and some major reforms. There was the carbon charge, RIP to that. There was the NDIS. There was the establishment of the Royal Commission into Childhood Sexual Abuse. And yet, if you talk to most people, then they will have a memory of chaos and confusion. But not a single bill was lost on the floor of House of Representatives. And by the time it got to the Senate, much of the negotiation had been done. So then it was just about rounding out some of that negotiations with some other independent senators then. So what was your experience of the negotiations?
There was a lot of working between the two houses. And David made some very significant points there a moment ago in terms of how the system works. But in that particular hung parliament, a lot of legislation was passed. I don't necessarily agree that the number of bills passed indicates how good the parliament particularly was. But it worked hard, there's no doubt about that. And there was a lot of interconnectivity between the House and the Senate before bills sometimes were even introduced. And I found that really encouraging. That I think one thing that came out of it is that, and David would probably agree, is that the independents slow the process down a bit. And I remember making a statement to Julia Gillard and Anthony Albanese when they, around Christmas time, there's always urgency, isn't there? Oh, we've got to get this stuff through. You've got to, David, Tony, you've got to think about it. I made the point, well, if you're going to apply this sort of pressure, where my vote is significant, the answer is no. Very early in the point, the answer is no. I'll vote against it if I'm not fully aware of what it actually means and referred to, as David mentioned, the experts that are out there. And one of the real advantages of being an independent, in my sense, is that there's a lot of very, very decent people who have knowledge in a whole range of areas that are only too willing to help, who don't want money for helping. And that's a significant input that they make into the parliament. The other thing that a lot of people don't recognise, Amy, is the makeup of the committee system in a hung parliament. And that was one of the most fascinating things for me to actually watch. I actually chaired one of the committees, but in a hung parliament, the committee membership, the makeup of the committees is reflected by that nature. The executive government that normally occurs in a majority circumstance doesn't have control of the outcomes of the committees, because a lot of committee work in the House is done, very genuine work, and then the government of the day will move in and say, well, we're not supporting those recommendations, and tell their people to vote against it. Well, I'll just give you one quick example. And when people say, oh, independents are useless, they can't do anything, hung parliaments, all the yabba, as you put it. I chaired a committee looking at the Murray-Darling Basin Committee. The government didn't have a majority on it. The opposition were on it. It reflected the makeup of that particular parliament. But what it also did, and this happened across a whole range of committees, is that it empowered all the members on those committees to actually get serious about an issue for once, because they didn't have the guided missile people at the back of them. They'd start to examine the issue, and I think it's what David was referring to then in terms of getting to the nub of the issue and improving the outcome. Now, when people say, oh, you'll never get anything done in a hung parliament, for 100 years, the various state governments that had some degree of ownership or control over the Murray-Darling system and the federal government could never agree, always because of politics. And it took this weak, feeble, unstable little Gillard government with a few independents on it to reach a point where legislation was passed. A lot of that, the recommendations for the legislation came out of the committee process. And, the National Party were involved in it, the Liberal Party were involved in it. Everybody was involved in it. And that empowered the legislative process. And I think you'll see more of that in hung parliaments as time goes on, because the independents, the crossbenchers, are more interested in the outcome of real issues than the politics. And just in conclusion, because it came into my empty brain, I often say the good thing about having an independent is it's not hard to get rid of them. But it's very difficult to get rid of some people in the major parties in some of the very, very safe seats.
Barnaby Joyce, for example. David, why do you think it's kind of taken to this point for people to start looking at independence again? Because as you rightly point out, there is nothing in the Constitution that says the Labor Party have to exist and govern, or the coalition has to exist and govern, and yet most voters would first go to one of those major parties when they think about politics, when they think about candidates. So what do you think it is about this moment that's made people go, maybe there is something else outside of this two-party system, given that we've had plenty of economic and social disruption in previous decades as well?
It's a good question. I'm probably not the best person to answer it. I think one of the things I see in Parliament House, and then talk to Canberrans, and when I travel around, talk to Australians about, our current setup's not working for us. Regardless of who's in government, they're making short-term decisions. And when you make short-term decisions, you can maybe get by for long enough, but it catches up with you. And I think it has well and truly caught up with us, from housing to a cost of living being driven by an economy that has so little competition in it, to climate, to just our tragic biodiversity crisis, this extinction crisis that we're in. And the major parties are still in denial about it. We've just gone through 3 years of a Labor government that promised the world and delivered absolutely nothing for nature. And I think more and more Australians are saying, well, what's the point of voting for someone who may be a lovely local member, says all the right things, and then gets in there and votes for the expansion of the gas industry, votes to not get more from the gas that we're exporting. And at the same time, I think we've seen independents like Tony, like Cathy McGowan, like Helen Haynes, Zali and others, actually standing up for their community on issues that are important to their community. And the thing that I see is, if you actually listen to Australians, doesn't matter where you are in the country, there's a whole bunch of things that people agree on. We actually have far more in common than our differences. Major parties will focus on those differences. And I think what I see with the independents doing is saying, well, hang on, we actually agree on a lot that isn't getting done. That's surely the starting point for us. So my hope is that we see more and more in there. I really see it as this incredibly important sort of self-correcting mechanism in our democracy that forces the major parties to go back to their roots and who they're meant to be representing. Again, to come back to electoral reform, rather than doing that, they're just trying to lock us out. But hopefully Australians recognise that, and we've got the next term of Parliament to try and correct that.
So, Tony, what happened in 2014? What happened to stop the independent movement in terms of being taken seriously by voters? Was the media to blame? Was it the major parties both turning against independence despite the fact that the parliament had been eminently workable and had been achieving things that people wanted? Like, what went wrong?
Well, I can't remember back that far. I thought 2014 was pretty good. Not politically. Lynn and I had a good year anyway. But the political system is absolutely threatened if either side can't control the House, the government. And that's about money and that's about media in terms of guiding people to have views of circumstances and the negative nature. And we're seeing it now. We're seeing it played out around the world. We're seeing it with Trump and others. The system that we put our faith in has been weakened considerably over time. And what I think is happening in terms of the communities are waking up and they're starting to say, well, we don't have to put up with this. We can put a decent person in there that actually thinks about the issues and reflects back to us. You know, I've had a saying for many years that the world is run by those who turn up, and that's what we've got to keep doing. We've got to keep turning up. I talk to a lot of people. I say, "Oh, I'm disgusted in politics. I don't know how you can stay interested in." Well, unless you stay interested, unless you stay involved, unless you start to turn up and get involved, and you can do that through the community processes that are existing these days. Unless you do that, you end up with a world like Trump. Now, that sort of nonsense can come to this place too. So that is a threat. These community independents, other independents as well, you know, the various crossbenchers, they are a threat to what the political system and the owners of the major parties think is something that they own. Well, democracy is a bit different to that, and I think we've got to make sure that we reclaim it at every step of the way that we can.
I think one of the points that Tony is making so well is that it's not just the major parties who don't like minority government. Today there was a fairly long article that was quoting at length the CEOs of Woodside and Beach Energy about how terrible a minority government would be for Australia and future, and you know, the lack of certainty about the expansion of the gas industry. And I think truly this is what we're up against. There are industries that are making a lot of money by destroying our future, and the major parties are facilitating that at the moment. And that doesn't align with what I hear from what most Australians want, but that's probably not what you're going to hear in the media.
And you've mentioned it a couple of times tonight, the electoral reforms, inverted commas, which essentially do lock out independents and minor party candidates who aren't already in the parliament from the next full 2028 election onwards. Do you think that that is the biggest indication of how terrified the major parties and some of their backers are of this trend of independents and potentially minority governments for the foreseeable future? How terrified they are of that prospect?
You'd have to say so. I mean, their primary vote's been declining for a long time now. And I guess they figured they had the numbers to stitch it up. There's undoubtedly some good things in this bill around transparency, lowering the disclosure threshold, real-time disclosures, things that we should have done years ago. But it's just loophole upon loophole that means that, yeah, it's just totally stacked in favour of the major parties.
Yeah, years ago, we had the two major parties. This is how I sort of explain it in my simplistic terms. One represented the worker and the other one the boss. When the various activities of Paul Keating and Bob Hawke with labour reforms came through, it sort of took a lot of that out of politics. So since then, the last 20 or 30 years, both sides have been struggling to find out what they actually believe, what they actually represent. So you had this crazy circumstance in 2010, 11, 12, where the bastions of the market system nearly killed people to stop a market price being applied to carbon, the emissions trading scheme, a market mechanism. So now we have this sort of desperate attempt to find out what divides people that can give us an opportunity to knock the other side off. So it's all focus groups, it's all this nonsense they carry on with to find a division. David made a point there earlier. A lot of the issues, it's not hard to find consensus if you're looking for it. But what we tend to do, the 93% of stuff we agree on, the 93% we agree on, we search for something that becomes a division. Climate change, one, it's way out there. It'll never affect us. Way out there. Let's vote for the short term again. The way in which we develop our telecommunication systems, all of those issues, capital gains tax and negative gearing, those sorts of issues, they've got to happen. We've got to start to address some of those significant taxation issues. And I take my hat off to people like Allegra Spender and others that are actually starting to deal with that. But people are going to get behind it. It will create change. But instead of being weak and unstable and chaotic, I see the upside where hung parliaments can actually drive some of the harder decisions through a consensual approach to the way they address those issues and those decisions.
It does depend on the crossbench though, right? Like all of this depends on the crossbench, because is there a threat that important voices or consensus voices don't get heard if there's a couple of old reliables sitting on the crossbench who are just going to give whoever the governing party is of the day their vote?
I don't think there'll be silence. So there's certainly, the government's always looking for the easiest votes. So if there's an issue that doesn't really matter to a senator, they're happy just to vote for it. They're going to lock them in early. But you've still got a voice in there, and I think when the crossbench really represents their communities and does so in a way where people are actually proud to have them as a representative, it's hard not to respect that. And I think the major parties end up wanting their vote. It's kind of a bit of a stamp on their legislation that, we got the crossbench. And again, sorry to come back to electoral reform, but they were so desperate to just get one amendment from the crossbench. Why aren't you putting up amendments to our crappy bill? And basically said to them, because you're going to accept something that the Libs want, and then you're going to say, well, look, the crossbench, got an amendment, so we got multi-partisanship. So yes, I think that's a risk. I think one of the bigger risks, if you look at countries that have parliaments that are constantly sort of working in minority, they have far more diversity in the media. And I think that's really going to be a challenge in a minority government, is how do you have a more nuanced policy debate in the media and not, as happened around something like the carbon price, just have an awful pile-on that just totally skews the public's view on something that is a market mechanism to deal with one of the biggest challenges we face.
And if you ever want to know exactly how politics works, I recommend that you read Peter Credlin and Barnaby Joyce's books and the chapters on the carbon charge, where they both admit that it was complete bullshit, their campaign against it, and it was just a great line and they just continued it. And at the moment that Peter Credlin decided to start calling it a tax and everyone in the media started calling it the carbon tax instead of a carbon price, was the moment that they knew that they had won.
That's where we'll leave this episode of Follow the Money. Thank you so much to Senator David Pocock and Tony Windsor for joining us. We would love to hear your thoughts on the show today, and you can reach out to us via email at podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au, or you can find us on social media. We're at australiainstitute.org.au on Blue Sky and at the Oz Institute with an AUS on Instagram and Twitter. Our theme music is by Jonathan McPeak from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ebony Bennett. Thanks for listening.